Well, let me introduce myself, so you know who I am. I'm a teacher from the Netherlands. I teach English and I teach music. My name is Tijmen Sprakel, a real Dutch name. I don't have really, I do not really have a Dutch appearance because I was born in Indonesia, but
Hmm.
trust me, I'm Dutch. And I interview people from around the globe to see how we can improve education and how we can raise and educate critical citizens. And I think you have an interesting story to tell, especially when it comes to raising awareness and critical citizens. I was really inspired by the work you did with Edward Snowden. And I was really surprised when you shared a tweet online of one of my interviews I did with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah,
So
caused quite a stir.
yeah, it did. So, um, why did you choose to share that particular part of my interview with Noam Chomsky, in which he stated that there is only one statesman of stature that has a sustainable solution for the Russia-Ukraine crisis, namely Donald Trump? Why did you choose that particular sentence?
Well, first of all, I think that the discourse in the West generally and in the US specifically around Ukraine has been very, kind of repressed. The left has been a little bit lost in terms of not knowing what they should or shouldn't say about Ukraine. They were kind of in the beginning emotionally and morally supportive of Ukraine, like most people were, because the scenes were obviously horrific. And I think most people agreed that the Russian invasion was unjustified, was an act of aggression. But in terms of what the US role should be, what NATO should be doing, I think there was a lot of uncertainty. And very quickly in that gap, there grew this Democratic Party consensus, not just the Biden administration, but even the left wing of the party, Bernie Sanders and the so-called squad, the left, most left-wing members of the Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and
Mhm.
Ilhan Omar, people like that. There was almost no dissent from the Biden administration at all on the center left to the left. And so the way that I found this interview was YouTube generously showed it to me as part of my algorithms, assuming I'm interested in what Noam Chomsky has to say, which of course I am and always have been. And when I saw him making this point, which I think he was making to be deliberately provocative, but nonetheless making it to underscore an important point, which is that what we on the left should be saying was his point, which is that there is no military outcome that's positive to this war that we ought to be pursuing. The only thing we should be thinking about is how to foster a diplomatic uh, solution that works for everybody and that terminates the hostilities. He very pointedly said that the only person he really hears saying this of any real stature, meaning a major figure like a former president or prime minister, was Donald Trump. And I purposely, I knew that that would cause the kind of controversy and debate that it did and put it there for that reason, because I think Chomsky's point was the same one I wanted to make, which is that the left has been very uh, cautious or even submissive and meek, almost disappeared when it comes to the debate in Ukraine. And the traditional left view is that when wars erupt, the best thing to do is to search for diplomacy and not send heavy weaponry to escalate the war.
It was this tweet was viewed over 2 million times. It stirred the debate. So why do you think this quote appealed to so many people?
Well, obviously, as I said, I think Chomsky was purposely being provocative.
Hmm.
I mean, Chomsky himself has essentially labeled Trump a Hitler-like figure, calling him,
The most dangerous man on earth,
yeah,
practically.
which I don't agree with. I think that's hyperbolic. I've never supported Chomsky's rhetorical approach to Trump or even his substantive approach to Trump. But precisely because Chomsky has been one of the most vocal critics, the most maximalist rhetoric deployed against Trump, for him to be going out of his way to say that there's only one person
Yeah.
who's saying what the left should be saying, which is that we need to have diplomacy and figure out how to end this war, not look for ways to prolong and fuel it. obviously there was a great cognitive dissonance to that. I think a lot of people on the
Yeah.
right like that. A lot of people on the left were angered by it.
Yeah.
And it created a real debate, which is what I was hoping to provoke about what the left-wing posture toward the war in Ukraine ought to be. And when Noam Chomsky, of all people, is telling them there's no real leftist leader standing up and saying this, only Donald Trump is, obviously that's going to cause a lot of soul searching on the part of the left.
So apparently he's still a major voice, a famous dissident in America, although he's ignored by the mass media. How come he still has such an important voice in the United States? How does he do? How does he manage to reach all these people?
Well, it's interesting, he is usually ignored in mainstream media discourse, except once every 4 years when he does his traditional announcement before the election that it's the duty of every leftist to vote for the Democrat, no matter how much the left might hate the Democratic Party. So he's very useful to the mainstream media and to mainstream Democratic Party politics once every 4 years, because he always dutifully comes forward and tells the left, if you're thinking about abstaining or voting for a third party, that's immoral. You need to vote for Democrats. So he always is used and given center stage every 4 years when he does that. But otherwise, he's saying things that the ruling class in DC doesn't really want to hear. And of course, they are very well adept at excluding him and ignoring him and pretending he doesn't exist. But for anyone who even nominally identifies as being on the left or having anti-war or anti-imperialism sentiments, Chomsky remains obviously a giant. He influenced. I always say, for me, he either directly influenced or indirectly influenced, meaning the people are influenced by him without knowing, almost every person who is of worth or has something valuable to say when it comes to foreign policy, war, militarism, and the like, propaganda. So he remains an incredibly important figure to the international left. And even when he says something like this, that they are already well positioned to disagree with. And I saw really ugly attacks from the left on Chomsky, claiming he's too old, he's senile, he has Alzheimer's, basically trying to bury him, which of course he's slowed down a little bit at the age of 93. But, I hope that at the age of, 60, I have that functionality that he has at 93. He still carries a lot of weight with the left, and that's a very good thing.
I sent him your tweet and I said, well, you have a new fan base from the right. And he said, well, that's very amusing. I'm getting a lot of hate from the left. So that was his very short reaction. One,
I mean, that was my little evil medicine, that my little evil magic, dark arts that I
I
thought
think,
would happen.
yeah, so many people only saw that particular tweet. But, I did an interview with Chomsky 2 years ago about DeVos, Betsy DeVos and Trump's education policy, and he slayed the whole policy. So he's certainly not a fan of Trump, but apparently
No, not at all.
people.
And I did note that in the very next tweet. I said, even in that interview, I think right after that, in fact, Chomsky went on to say again that what he always says is that Trump is an incredibly dangerous figure, which is what makes that statement that he made so notable.
Yeah. One of the most inspiring books, I think, is Manufacturing Consent, especially during times of war and during times of crisis, COVID-19 crisis. The media play a hugely important role. In one of your what's the name of your podcast?
System updates.
System updates. You talked about that this is actually the first media war that is played out in the media, the Russia-Ukraine war. It's the first war in which social media plays such an important role. Sorry. And Chomsky describes the 5 filters of mass media. And I was wondering if we could discuss shortly these 5 filters and the way in which mass media is manipulated by these 5 filters. Starting with ownership. So what does the American media landscape look like when it comes to ownership?
Right. So just on the premise of your question, I think I have promoted, and probably myself have talked about, the importance of social media in this war in terms of creating consensus and the like. I don't think I was the first to do that. And I also think that, a lot of people have pointed out, and I think it's true, that other wars over the last decade have seen social media play a huge role. The war in Syria, for example, I think social media drove a lot of opinion about that. I think the ability of Gazans to use their cell phones to show what happens in Gaza when the Israelis attack has been vital for changing public opinion. But I think this is the first major war between sovereign states where most people are getting their information curated principally through social media. Um, and I think what that is doing is it is creating a kind of instant consensus, not just within certain countries, but globally, because, you know, everybody is more or less connected to the same information
Yeah.
stream on Twitter, on Facebook, and the like. Um, and this is one of the reasons why, I find the cause of internet freedom and opposing online censorship by the government and the union of corporate and big tech and U.S. security state power so important is because Chomsky's model of propaganda relied upon, as you said, the first filter being this ownership model where,
Yeah.
the small handful of major corporate news outlets were all owned by giant corporations controlled by the society's richest people. And obviously they have a specific interest in what ideas to suppress and what ideas to promote. And to me, one of the promises of the Intercept from the beginning was it was going to liberate us from that. It was going to decentralize information that would be citizen driven and that would free up the streams of information from these centralized Chomsky propaganda models that depend upon centralized ownership. And it was working until this kind of union of state power, big tech, and especially corporate media insisted upon increasing levels of censorship, which meant that back into their hands was returned the very means of communication information distribution that was supposed to be what subverted their control. And that's why I find it so menacing.
You mean censorship on Twitter, on Facebook, on Google, on YouTube? So you founded the Intercept in order to separate yourself from these big corporate enterprises, and now it's very difficult to escape from their censorship. So do you manage actually to escape from their censorship? Do you think you're able to freely write whatever you like?
I mean, I haven't been deplatformed or banned from any major social media site. On the other hand, I think that we've seen a major escalation in censorship, and first with COVID, where any kind of dissent from the kind of consensus of Dr. Fauci and the World Health Organization was silenced and suppressed and punished more intensely and repressively than anything I had seen previously. And the war in Ukraine elevated it to an entire new level where even states like in the EU and regulatory bodies around the world are now starting to much more aggressively force and order and social media platforms to silence and remove, for example, Russian state media or messaging that they regard as pro-Russian under the threat of and force of law, which is a major escalation in the censorship regime that obviously is going to start to expand, as censorship always does, beyond this initial cause of the war in Ukraine. And over the past 2 weeks, Twitter has twice taken action against my tweets. One was in connection with an observation I made about the connection between the iconography of the Buffalo and New Zealand mass shooters and the symbols used by the Azov Battalion. And another instance was when I tried to link to the manifesto left by the Buffalo shooter twice. I think one time I was suspended from Twitter for 12 hours, and another time there was some warning label placed on my tweet. So I think that what you're seeing is everybody who has any kind of dissenting posture is starting to become put under this microscope with increasing intensity. And that was why the whole, what should have been a small story, which is Elon Musk wanting to buy Twitter just to
Mhm.
restore a modicum of free speech to Twitter,
Exactly.
instead became such a giant cause of panic, because it shows you how important the censorship regime is to them to maintain that and to fight anybody who threatens to subvert it.
So you don't have high hopes when it comes to Elon Musk liberating Twitter from censorship.
I think that what you're already seeing, and I've said this from the start, is obviously people should be skeptical of his motives. But even if his motives are totally pure and totally faithful to what he's claiming they are, which is to bring back free speech to Twitter, I also really question his ability to do it, because the ability to censor major internet platforms has become such a valuable weapon to the most powerful ruling elite centers on the planet and in the West, that the idea that they're just going to allow Elon Musk to waltz in and take Twitter out of their hands and stop censoring it and allow free information to flow again, something incredibly threatening to them, I think was always very fanciful. And already before the sale is even consummated, you're seeing the New York Times running an absurd hit piece on Elon Musk, trying to link him to the apartheid regime in South Africa, to which he had absolutely no connections. And if you actually read deep enough into the story, you'd find that he actually befriended and publicly defended Black colleagues and students at a time when doing so subjected you to recrimination. They have suddenly uncovered or surfaced a alleged sexual harassment complaint from a flight attendant on SpaceX. And they even announced that they would initiate an antitrust investigation from the Federal Trade Commission about this proposed sale of Twitter, which is so much less threatening to, from an antitrust perspective, than so many transactions they've allowed to go forward with no scrutiny, that you can already see, just from the mere possibility that they might buy Twitter, that they will unite to try and destroy him, and not just Twitter, but the rest of his companies. And I don't think he quite anticipated how much opposition there would be.
I see. So he might have great big ideas to liberate Twitter and to promote free speech, but we have to take in consideration the other parties like the mainstream media, which will, to speak in Chomsky's terms, calls him a lot of flack when he tries to publish his views. Um,
Yep.
the Senate has just passed a $40 billion bill, and I was really amazed by that kind of money. But what amazes me most is the story behind it. How do you sell such a war to your own citizens? What kind of story do you tell to the average Joe? Why should the Americans go to war? Because I think it's an American war. Um, with Russia. So, a couple of questions. What's the status quo in America right now? And my second question is, what does the Joe Biden administration tell its citizens? How do they motivate these kinds of spendings?
So war propaganda is probably the most potent type of propaganda, in part because anything relating to war is so genuinely horrific that if you can stimulate people's emotions surrounding it, you can get them to almost agree to anything. And that's why the trajectory of American wars, going at least back to the Vietnam War, if not earlier, is that whenever bipartisan Washington proposes a new war, the public is very much in support of it across the political spectrum, both sides of the two-party system, across ideologies. And within, depending on the war, some period of time, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, the public overwhelmingly comes to oppose the war and realizes that it was a mistake to have fought it, because there's no benefits that were bestowed upon Americans or really anybody else. And it was just gigantic amounts of money going out the window to enrich weapons manufacturers and killing lots of people for no clear purpose. And so the question becomes, why do Americans who go through that process every time, that same process of supporting a war at the beginning and then ending up regretting it, are they so susceptible to kind of being tricked by the same techniques every time? And the answer is because, if you show video footage of Kurdish victims of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons attack at a time when the US was very close allies with Saddam Hussein, but if you leave that part out, they're going to hate Saddam Hussein, and they're going to be really angry about Saddam Hussein. If you show them how Saddam Hussein is repressing Iraqis, they're going to hate him, and they're going to want to go to war against him to punish him and free the Iraqis people of tyranny. Or if you show them how women in Afghanistan are being repressed by the Taliban, or if you tell them that the South Vietnamese have been invaded by the North Vietnamese communists, and we have to go defend the democracy of our allies in South Vietnam, If you show them Libyans suffering at the hands of Gaddafi, you can get them to agree to anything. It's very visceral. It's a kind of tribal instinct to say, yeah, Putin is this historically evil man. We haven't seen anything like him since since Hitler, rather. And so, of course, nobody would be opposed to a war uniting behind the Ukrainians to stop such evil. And then as the days and the weeks and the months go by and people start seeing, tens of billions of dollars flying out the door at once, while, as you say, they're suffering under soaring gas prices and inflation and having to forego buying things that a year ago they were able to buy as part of their family budget, they do start to ask, well, why again are we spending now $54 billion and soon to be $100 billion, larger than the entire Russian military budget for a full year on
Insane.
this war, all the way on the other side of the world in Ukraine? Why are my interests being subordinated to the interests of the Ukrainians by my own government? And what the strategy is at the beginning is to make those questions taboo, so that if whoever asks them gets accused of being a Russian agent or not caring about the Ukrainians, so they punish you, they stigmatize you, they demonize you. If you ask those questions at the beginning, and the emotions that are generated from the propaganda are so strong that nobody wants to have that question. And even now, when the bill to spend another $40 billion on top of the $14 billion already spent just 10 weeks into this war was rushing through Congress, there were a few dozen members of Congress, just a few dozen, all
11.
Republicans.
11. It was 86 to 11.
Yeah, 86 to 11 in the Senate. The House vote was 256 to 57. So 57 House members voted no, all Republicans, 11 senators voted no. So that's 68 people, all Republicans, who voted no. And a lot of them were just trying to say, wait a minute, before we rush and do that, let's at least just have some basic oversight. Like, where is this money going to? To whom is it going, and for what? Where are these weapons going? These incredibly dangerous weapons.
That was exactly what Rand Paul said. I think that was his main criticism, not helping Ukraine. Transparency. Where is this money going? I think that was his main question.
And where are the weapons going? Because, Ukraine is notoriously corrupt. It has a very vibrant black market for weapons. And I could easily hear, 5 or 10 years from now that we need to go to war in some other place, because all these weapons that we poured into Ukraine have now migrated to this other part of the world. And now there's this other terrorist group or government or whoever that's a threat. That's what happened in Afghanistan as well. We poured all those weapons into the Mujahideen that then became Al-Qaeda, and those regions were filled with incredibly dangerous weapons. We kind of always, spawn our new wars with our current war policies. And the fact that those questions couldn't even be asked shows you that still in the United States, there is an extremely repressive climate about the range of debates that can be heard on the war in Ukraine. And that's why I so often try and show the American left, not just Chomsky's statement, but for example, in Brazil, where I live, the candidate leading the polls and likely to be the president of Brazil, again, Lula da Silva, who's a very respected center-left politician, has been, remarkably pointed about his criticism of the US and NATO fueling this war, encouraging Zelensky to believe that he can beat the Russians. And there's so much dissent in most of the world, but in the US and Western Europe, there's very little. And that it kind of feeds on itself. And the more people get that propaganda reinforced, the more they believe there's just no other side of the story, no other valid way to think.
How does it work, this mechanism? How does the government enforce its policy on its citizens? What's that? What are their tactics?
Well, I think at least in the US, the starting point has to be this basic understanding that although in theory the media is supposed to be adversarial to the government, it's supposed to be the fourth estate, all that, those fairy tales about how it serves as an adversarial check or oversight force on the government. The reality is the largest media corporations in the US government have a very close and cooperative relationship, which is why when the Bush administration wanted to propagandize the public to go to war in Iraq in 2002 and 3, their greatest ally was the New York Times, which every day published on their front page anonymous, unconfirmed leaks that convinced Americans to believe that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. It didn't come from Fox News. Liberals didn't trust Fox News. They needed liberal outlets, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, NBC News, and all of them were on board. So I think one of the key propaganda tactics is that the media will single out a couple of examples to make of people who are raising dissent early on. So two people in particular, I would say, before the war happened, were the ones who got most villainized. One was Tulsi Gabbard, the 3-term Democratic Congresswoman from Hawaii, who famously in 2016 resigned as the vice chair of the DNC, protesting the way that the party was cheating on behalf of Hillary Clinton and against Bernie Sanders. And she wanted to support Bernie Sanders, so she resigned her seat. And then the Fox host, Tucker Carlson. Tulsi's point was, as somebody who fought for her country in Iraq, who volunteered to fight in Iraq, that war is the most heinous thing that can happen. And therefore, we should be doing much more than we are to try and negotiate with the Kremlin to find a solution to the war, to promise that NATO won't go into Ukraine, that all the things Chomsky was saying, that Crimea will be Russian. They want it to be Russian. They are Russian. That's, probably never going to change. And even like some independent concessions of independence for those regions in eastern Ukraine that are largely Russian speaking and ethnic Russian and feel an allegiance to Moscow, that at least we should have been, promising to pull back some of the NATO expansion that Moscow found threatening. There were no efforts to do that. And her only point was we should be trying to do more to negotiate, which was Chomsky's point. Tucker Carlson's point was, why, which is the question you asked me, which is, why as an American citizen should I care enough about what's happening in Ukraine to have my government get involved in such a dangerous war with the country with the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, which is Russia. And all he was doing there was kind of repeating Barack Obama's worldview, which is they were trying to pressure Obama for 8 years to arm the Ukrainians. And his view was, look, Ukraine is of vital interest to Russia, but it isn't and never will be to the United States because it's a bordering country for Russia, but not for us. And just for those very reasonable and mild expressions of dissent, you can just go Google either Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard, and you will see how widely and definitively, authoritatively, they were alleged to have been propagandists for Russia, Kremlin assets, and everyone saw that. And when you see that, it's, we're all tribal beings. We're political and social animals as humans. We say, I don't want to be ostracized and vilified the way they are being. So I'm going to sit over here in my corner and just kind of be quiet or go along.
I think it's media filter number 5, which Chomsky discussed, the common enemy, which is Russia in this case, which has been a common enemy of the United States for so long. Originally, the fifth filter was communism, but he changed it later into a common enemy. So I think it was really easy for the American government to persuade the American people to protect themselves from Russia. Am I right?
Yeah, when my kind of split with parts of the left really began in 2016, in the middle of the Clinton-Trump campaign, when Hillary Clinton's campaign unveiled the primary attack on Donald Trump, which was this very McCarthyite Cold War script of what is Donald Trump, doing with the Russians? He seems to have some kind of secretive affiliation or loyalty to Moscow. The Kremlin has leverage over him. It was this kind of very dark and sinister McCarthyite script about all these people suddenly being beholden to the Kremlin. And part of why I knew that was so alarming was not just because there was no evidence for it. It was a fake scandal that came from the CIA. That was true. But more so because I knew that it was going to teach an entire new generation of Americans who were paying attention for the first time to politics because of Donald Trump or because they just were coming of age to regard Russia as this existential and grave enemy, which the Americans kind of have in their DNA at this point to believe, because as you said, for 7 or 8 decades, that was the main story we were told, that our prime enemy was Moscow. And as you said, even though it was communist, then the story has barely changed, even though they have a much different ideology. They're not the Soviet Union anymore. But it's like inculcated into American political culture to regard Russia as the enemy. And I think it was this perfect storm where conservatives, people on the right, have long been told to regard the Russians as our enemy. They like these kind of wars and these postures of moralizing and militarism. But Democrats have been told since 2016 that the reason they lost that important election that elected Donald Trump and prevented Hillary Clinton from being president wasn't because their neoliberal ideology had, harmed the lives of tens of millions of people, but it was the fault of the Kremlin. It was the fault of Putin and the Russians. And they've been feeding on this anti-Russian sentiment for so long that when the opportunity came to now say, oh, look, we told you Russia was evil, Russia is dangerous, the population was just primed to unite around that view.
Do Americans still consider Russia to be a communist country, or have
you can go back and find in kind of the early Trump years when a lot of liberal pundits trying to rile people up to be angry about Russia would refer to them as the communists. Liberals use the language of like what the far right used to use for liberals during the Cold War. Like if you dissent at all, they'll call you comrade, which obviously is a term of communist activism to imply that you're a Russian. So it's kind of accusing you of being a communist, which is really a proxy for accusing you of being loyal to the Kremlin, even though the Kremlin is not communist anymore. They frequently talk about the KGB, especially in the context of Putin, who had a kind of career with the KGB before becoming a politician, even though the KGB doesn't exist anymore. So all of these themes that were, associated with the propaganda to turn Americans into anti-Russian fanatics are still very much in use, even when these institutions no longer even exist.
So my question for now is, where has COVID gone?
It's interesting because if you look at the data, in many places, the levels of transmission and even hospitalization are still quite high. But I think there came this notion that with the Omicron variant, we were permitted to assume that it was no longer sufficiently threatening, that we had to radically change or even at all change the way of living or way of life. And it is interesting how it kind of just disappeared out of nowhere, from nothing, because the science and the data hasn't really changed that much. In fact, there are certain places in the United States, I don't know how it is in Western Europe, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, that are now starting to reimpose mask mandates for indoor settings. The CDC is now strongly encouraging people to wear masks indoors in places where there's a high level of transmission. It just seems that the population got kind of tired of it, didn't want to hear about it anymore. And I think Democrats are very, very worried that the anger, particularly over the way schools were closed for so long, which I think people have a hard time understanding the rationale behind, and especially the growing realization that that probably had a very significant and harmful impact on their children without any real scientific rationale behind it, that the Democrats are very worried that they're going to be punished for that politically with an election coming up in November, and they just don't want to get anywhere near COVID again.
Do you think COVID is used by governments to strengthen their surveillance policies?
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, like I said before, COVID was used to justify an increase in internet censorship. It was obviously used as a way to impose unprecedented control on populations, to force people to remain indoors, to tell them where they could and couldn't go, all kinds of different restrictions that they imposed on people's lives. So there's no question that COVID has been used for all kinds of unprecedented population control measures. And saying that clearly the COVID pandemic became a justification for governments around the world to impose previously unthinkable restrictions and limitations on the movement of their citizens, on whether you can go out, how you can go out, where you can go, how you can be tracked, information you have to provide. It really was, I think, alarming in the way that it conditioned populations to accept an entirely new and, again, previously unthinkable level of government intrusion and government control in the name of fighting this pandemic.
I want to move on to this fad on social media. Well, it's not really a fad. It's a term that's used a lot, especially here in the Netherlands. It's called the Great Reset. And it's used in many ways. Some people really see it as a conspiracy theory. Some people even think that the vaccines contain microchips. Some people think there's a global elite that's going to take over and doing some great reset. You know, if you visit the White House website right now, you will see the slogan "Build Back Better." What do you know of this term, the Great Reset? What does it mean to you? What do you know about it?
I think what a lot of this reflects is discourse around the Great Reset and some of these phrases like "you'll own nothing and you'll be happy about it," which isn't exactly the phrase, but it's what kind of got accepted in popular discourse is what the motto was, reflects what I think is a valid concern that people's lives increasingly are being controlled not by local governments or state governments or even federal governments, where they at least nominally have some democratic accountability and influence. They vote for their leaders, the leaders make decisions through a legislature that they elect about what laws they're subjected to. But I think instead people are seeing this kind of transnational global elite, which obviously exists, and you can see them at Davos and the World Economic Forum that's currently taking place, and in lots of globalistic institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, that have an enormous amount of influence on people's lives, even though they barely, they barely know where these institutions are located, let alone who these people are running them, let alone believing that they have any say in them. And they, as a result, have developed a great deal of mistrust, I think rightfully so, in whether these institutions are acting in accordance with any minimal democratic values or democratic norms, or whether it's an attempt on the part of these kind of super elites to act in concert with one another and in secret for their own interest, to advance their own interests at the expense of everybody else's. Clearly, one of the things they do is they get together and they talk about the future. And their documents you can look at as kind of these benign attempts to understand and observe how the future is going to play out, given things like the challenge of climate change and other things, or you can view them as extremely nefarious kind of conspiracies to change the earth for their benefit at the expense of everybody else. And my guess is, most of the time, the truth is somewhere in between. These are very powerful people. I don't think they meet with each other all over the world constantly and produce all kinds of plans and documents with the intention of them being inconsequential. I think they assume that they're going to have some kind of influence. And the fact that people who hear about what they're doing don't give them the benefit of the doubt is entirely their fault. Like if they want to claim, well, the Great Reset is just this like benevolent term that recognizes that as technology changes, as our challenges change, we have to adapt to it. But the public is hearing it as you want to radically reshape the global order for your own benefit with no democracy anywhere at play. It's their fault. They have to understand and try and analyze why what they're doing and the way they're doing it is breeding so much distrust. And I don't think it's hard to see if you look at the lives of people in the democratic world, the kind of frustrations that led to Trump and Brexit and Bolsonaro and the rise of, right-wing populism in Eastern and Western Europe, you see that the ideology of globalism and global institutions and neoliberal ideology on which it runs has destroyed the lives of hundreds of millions of people,
Exactly.
probably billions, and people know that and are angry about it, and they know who to blame for it. And so you
And
can debate each individual allegation, but I think the much more important point is this overarching distrust that they have quite validly bred.
yeah, but it's no rocket science how to make a more equitable planet. I mean, healthcare for everybody, clean drinking water, food for everybody. I mean, and one of the most memorable events I thought was Rutger Bregman. You know, the guy who spoke in Davos and said, "Well, we should." tax the rich, and what are you guys doing flying in with all your private jets? And you saw the clash between Tucker Carlson and Rutger Bregman.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so well, that's I'm interviewing Thierry Maleret in 3 weeks, and he's the
Uh-huh.
co-author of COVID-19: The Great Reset. So it's really easy to follow the common narrative and to distrust everything they say. But I think as a journalist, it's important to investigate and scrutinize all sides. So I'm happy that Thierry agreed to do an interview in 3 weeks. So we are going to talk about the Great Reset, and let's see what he has to tell about it.
Well,
So,
great. I'm glad people like you are devoted to airing these kinds of ideas. I think it's really important. I appreciate your asking me to come on.
well, my last question is who should I interview next if I want to? Um, well, it's my mission and my goal to educate and raise critical students. And I think you were a great example of a person who's critical. Um, who inspires you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I was saying it earlier on, I mean, probably one of the people who most inspired me. I mean, I've kind of had two careers in my life. First as a constitutional lawyer, and the second half of my kind of adult life has been devoted to journalism. So I had different influences for each. But certainly, when I began writing about politics and journalism, for sure, one of my biggest influences was Chomsky. I think Daniel Ellsberg and the heroism he displayed when he leaked the Pentagon
Yeah.
Papers, and was willing to go to jail for life to do it, was a major influence. I think that I.F. Stone, in terms of how he did journalism, with almost, he didn't want sources inside the government to tell him what to say. He just liked to deal with original documents and find the truth, just using the publicly available information and analyzing it in a newsletter that was supported entirely by his readers was a really inspiring model to me. And I think Edward Snowden has had a big impact on how I look at the world too, given the risk that he undertook. And I think what all of them have in common is a willingness to take a step back and to start questioning whether the things that they're being told to believe aren't true. And at some point, if you're not willing to do that as a human being, you are kind of leaving on the table one of the greatest tools that you have as a human, which is the ability to think critically. And I think the more people are talking about how to do that and thinking about how to do that, the better we'll be.
I'm letting you go. You have your next meeting in a few minutes. Glenn, it was a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. Thanks for your time. And
Absolutely. Thanks. Keep up the great work. And I was delighted to be with you.